Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making it to the 12th IU lunch talk that we are hosting today. I'm Jo Puri, and I head the Independent Evaluation Unit. And on behalf of my team and I, we're very glad to have you here yet again for sandwiches and a good conversation. So, as you know, the IU talks are a forum for us where we can talk about things related of interest to the GCF, to climate change, to evidence, to evaluation, to learning, just about anything. And so what I'm going to do now is also to encourage all of you to think about people that you'd like to bring to these talks so that we can learn more and become faster, better, smarter. IU lunch talks are usually held, they are monthly talks. We have speakers who are luminaries in their field from all across the world. And in the past, we've had the Director General of ICIMOD, as you know. We've also had talks on certain thematic areas. Today, we're going to be talking about organizational learning and how we can enhance that and use some techniques to do that. Before I go on and give you rules of the game, I also want to tell you that as the next IU talk will be on the 21st of June, where we'll feature Dr. Brad Parks, who is from AData at College of Williams, and he'll be here and talking about GIS techniques and what you can do to enhance your own learning using GIS techniques and systems. So a little bit about today's talk. It's titled Dynamic Learning and Evaluation, and it's going to feature a review of the GCF portfolio that Nathan and I have been working on now for almost 6 months. And it started off, the genesis of this work is essentially when I joined, I thought it might be useful for us to understand the extent to which we can, given the current state of proposals that are approved by the board, what we can do to learn from these. So it's meant to be really done in using a learning lens. But then I've also got Nathan here to give us some guidance on what are the experiences in terms of organizational learning that we can adopt and really stand on the shoulders of giants in doing that and reflect on experiences from other organizations. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nathan shortly. Nathan is an assistant professor at the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Connecticut. I had known Nathan actually from my earlier life as well when I was still working at 3IE. And Nathan's been working now with me on this work now for the past 6 months, like I said, and will continue to work with Solomon, also my colleague here, and myself as we go forward. Nathan has worked with several international organizations, including IFAD and FAO and UNICEF. And he has more than 10 years of experience conducting impact evaluations and has conducted research in several sub-Saharan African and Asian countries, including Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, India, and Paraguay. So rules for today's game are as follows. Nathan will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll basically open it up for Q&A. And I'll moderate Q&A, try and be provocative. This is a safe space. Use it as you will. We definitely want to encourage as much dialogue as possible. This is an event that is being recorded like all other IU webinars. It will be available. We're also encouraging you to tweet, use hashtags and a handle, and also know that evidence previously has shown that people who tweet are actually absorbing the material much more than people who don't. So if you are, please tweet.
They are living examples for them.
So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nathan.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you all for having me here today. I didn't realize I only had 25 minutes. I'm glad I deleted 5 slides just a few minutes ago. So hopefully we'll get through this. So just a little bit more about myself. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. I do randomized controlled trials. That's mostly my specialty. Mostly what I work on are large-scale projects implemented by governments or the World Bank or other large NGOs. But what I'm really most interested in personally is how to improve organizational learning. So what do you do once you've done an impact evaluation? How do you translate that into actual changes within an organization? But how do you also make sure that the evaluation that you're running is relevant for the organization itself? And so I'm going to try my best today to give you some information that hopefully you can take back to your programming and to the things that you're doing and think about how you can actually apply that there. Maybe I won't necessarily do that very well in the amount of time that we have, but I'm around all week, so I'm happy to talk some more about that. So let me just jump right into it. So first, I'm going to start out with a really quick overview of the GCF portfolio. As Joe said, we've been working for the past few months to assess the proposals that have come into the fund. We're assessing them on a range of different things. So far we've formally assessed a little bit over 55 projects, but it's ongoing. I think in the end we'll have something like 70 or 80 that we'll be done with. We're especially interested in a couple of topics. So one of the things that I think is really key for understanding a program is the theory of change. And so for those of you that are not familiar with the theory of change, this is where you basically just write down all your models and assumptions behind how you get from an activity to the impacts that you want to actually achieve. There's a lot of things that happen along the way, right? So you have an activity that you're trying to do. Can you implement it? What happens once you implement it? What do people do with that program once you've implemented it? All right, the theory of change makes it clear what it is that you think is actually going to be happening with your program. And not just whether or not it has a positive effect, but what those effect sizes might be and what the effect is going to be on. So there's a lot of unintended consequences and ways that impacts can happen, and the theory of change helps us to get a little bit ready to think about how those things might be going on. Sometimes our theory of change is completely wrong. I'm not saying that we have to, that we can literally sit down and write out a theory of change and that's what the model of the world is. You're almost always wrong when you write out a theory of change, but it's still writing out a model and some kind of assumptions that you can work with. Second thing I think is really important is the causality and impact measurement. So a lot of the programs, and I won't be talking about them in too much detail today, but the programs that we've been looking at, they assume that there's going to be some kind of activity, and that's going to lead to some kind of magnitude of impact, right? Well, what that is assuming is that it's a causal impact, that without that program, you wouldn't have seen that change anyway. And so that program is making an additionality, some kind of causal change to the world. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes, but this is a really critical part of understanding what impact evaluation is, but also understanding about a program we might believe the theory of change that we're actually writing down. And then, of course, I think most importantly for you guys, and this is something that I'm still a little bit ignorant on, so I apologize if this part of my talk is a little bit less focused for you, but there's the investment criteria. And this is obviously what GCF is especially interested in. All right, so understanding the impact, sustainable development, cost effectiveness, and the paradigm shift potential. All right, and so we're going to try and evaluate all of these things as best as we can. Before we get to that, I want to thank Peter. Where are you, Peter? He's also been a key part of developing this. So Peter's helped us with understanding a little bit about the portfolio. I just want to make a couple of quick comments. So first off, of those 55 proposals that we've appraised or assessed so far, the vast majority of them are coming from Africa. Next, we have projects from Asia, then Latin America, and then to a lesser extent, Oceania, and then Central America. So there's obviously a lot of focus on Africa and different poor regions. When we think about what's the programs that are trying to affect some kind of mitigation, right, the tons of CO2 that they're trying to mitigate, that is really basically dominated by Africa. Right? This is actually really important for a lot of these types of programs. I'm going to give you some examples of programming that kind of fits with some of the proposals that we've seen in the fund. But how do we get to this assumption, this number here, all right? So this number is, Peter went through all the proposals, added up everything that everybody thinks is going to actually be mitigated, and this is the number that we get. All right? How do we actually get to that number? Do we believe that that's what we're going to actually impact in the world? And so that's actually going to be a key part of what I'll be talking about at the end. So we also created as part of the assessments, a stoplight. So we have very detailed individual assessments of the proposals. We also have a more aggregate level where we're trying to assess some of the risk and issues with the individual proposals as they relate to theory of change, data collection reporting, implementation performance, and then evaluation potential. We're still working on this. I'm not going to show you these results just yet, but this is going to be something that's going to help us kind of summarize together what it is that we're seeing across the entire portfolio. But let me just talk really quickly. I'm sorry if there's a lot of text in some of these slides. I just want to comment really quickly on some of the bigger, broader issues that I've seen when doing the assessments of these proposals. So first off, most of the proposals have either none or very limited theory of change. Now I'm coming from a perspective where I want to see a really detailed theory of change so that I can understand how the program is going to go from their activities to the actual impacts that they're going to have, that 36 million of tons of CO2 mitigation, things like that. But most of the proposals don't have a very well-developed theory of change. This is not surprising. Most organizations I work with, even large organizations that run full-scale impact evaluations, have very weak theory of change. There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong about that, but I think that's something that we want to address and work on a bit. And that's because the theory of change is really critical for connecting those activities to what's going to be actually the impact. Second area that we paid a lot of attention to is the causality and attributable measurement of impact. All right, so this is where, and not too surprisingly, again, the proposals were not really focused on developing causal attribution, and so not surprisingly, most of them don't have a very good discussion about why we should believe when you hand somebody a program, when you're delivering a program in a country, why is it that we're going to actually see changes because of that program? It's a hard thing to talk about in a proposal, it's a hard thing to think about in your program, but it's a really critical part, making sure that we understand what it is that we're going to actually be doing. What are the impacts that we'll actually have? And so what I think is most interesting, and this is, again, really common in a lot of organizations, is that the assumptions about how you get to the impact is basically mechanical. All right, now I'm going to show you an example. It's one of my favorite examples of clean cookstove technology. All right, so this is a fantastic kind of technology that engineers in a laboratory have created. They found ways to reduce the amount of fuel that people use, reduce the amount of smoke in homes. And so we know from the laboratory, if you use it perfectly, you're going to save this much firewood and this much CO2. A lot of organizations then say, well, we're going to hand out 1,000 of these, so let's multiply that by what the engineers tell us, and that's going to be the impact that we're going to have. So the problem is that's a really mechanical estimation that doesn't take into account how people actually use these devices. And that matters a lot in the real world when we're trying to think about what actual impacts could be. There's also a lot of interest in the programs for targeting. So how is the program going to reach people? All these proposals like to talk about vulnerable populations. Not a lot of discussion about how you actually reach those vulnerable populations. That's something I'm going to also talk about in the end when I give some examples. It's really hard to reach some people like this. Discussion on the effectiveness, efficiency, and sustainability and impact. As similar to what I said, most of the proposals don't really articulate the changes very well. General issues on return to investment. As I said, there's this, mechanical assumption that people have. So basically, it's not really clear what the take-up and usage assumptions are for these programs. Again, you're handing people, say, a clean cook stove or, funds to start clean energy or construction. What is the actual take-up rate? How are people going to actually take that up and use it? And then finally, there's also a pretty sparse amount of information on how M&E systems are actually going to be done. Now, as a researcher, as somebody that works on impact evaluation, I spend most of my time at later stages from the M&E. So it's monitoring and evaluation, if you're not familiar with it. I take that as kind of given, and I move past that when I'm trying to measure impact. But I recognize that monitoring and evaluation is a critical part to being able to understand what it is that's actually being done, so we can understand what it is that we're actually doing and why it would be reasonable that there might be some kind of impact, right? And so the M&E system is really critical to understand what is actually being done. And this is where I think, some of the secondary accountability, the due diligence and monitoring that's conducted by the Global Climate Fund, organizations don't like to do M&E, all right? A lot of organizations see that as a distraction from their main program. It's up to us to push those programs to do that. Right? As the donor, as the manager of the fund, we have to be the ones responsible for telling these organizations, you have to do this. Right? If it's not coming from the donor, it's actually very common that most organizations don't want to bother with it. So we have a couple of proposed next steps. So, one of the things that Peter and I have been working on is to try and get a more comparable picture across projects. So a common reporting framework would be really nice for these so that we can actually track how things are moving and changing across these different proposals. As I said, we've constructed individual assessments of each of the proposals. I hope that everybody's going to read through at least the one that's appropriate for their program, but also think about some of the broader critiques of what's lacking. And then finally, and this is where the rest of my talk is going to go, developing impact evaluations of these programs. Now, I'm actually proposing that we not evaluate everything. All right, you can't really go from 0 to 70 or 80, overnight. I've seen organizations try to do that, and it becomes a giant mess. So what I'm suggesting is that we actually take a subset of the programs that are actually able to accommodate an impact evaluation, a learning exercise about their program. And this is what Solomon and Joe and I are hopefully going to be working on for the next few months. All right, so what I think would be great is that this could provide a really important learning exercise for these programs, allowing GCF to better understand the portfolio, but also to demonstrate to other programs that this type of learning is feasible and useful. All right, and so when you do it really well and you make sure that it is really of direct value to an organization, to a program, all right, what I hope is that gets more and more organizations excited. So what do I mean about evaluation? So first off, why do we want to evaluate? So there's a couple of reasons why we might want to do an impact evaluation. So I'll say evaluate and impact evaluation interchangeably. One thing, first, we want to understand the impact of a program. All right, so as I said before, are we really reaching these mitigation goals that we had set for ourselves? But also, evaluation is really useful when you're designing new programs and you want to understand whether or not that new program works, what about it works, refining existing designs to think about how can we make it work a little bit better. We can also use evaluation to improve our program targeting and make sure that we're actually reaching out to the people that we want to be reaching out to the most. And then we can also do basically a cost-benefit analysis, so we can identify the most efficient and effective programs for the money that's spent and scale those up. Those would be the ones that we might be the most excited about kind of increasing and growing, right? But we don't know what is the most impactful until we do some kind of evaluation and understand about its cost. So to be clear, those of you that are familiar with monitoring, monitoring is not impact evaluation. So let me just be clear that traditional monitoring evaluation has no inherent causality. All right, so what monitoring is about is to answer the questions of the program being implemented as it was designed. Could you maybe improve your operations to be a little bit more efficient? And are you actually reaching out to those people that you intended? All right, so if your program was intended to reach 50% women, all right, how would you ever know it if you don't have an M&E framework to be able to tell you, are you reaching 50%? Are you only reaching 30%? So that's what M&E is really good at. What impact evaluation does is address the causality issue. All right, so these are causal statements. What's the effect of the program on some kind of outcome? All right, I'm leaving this a little bit vague right now. I'll give you some examples of some outcomes in a minute. Because of the program, are people actually better off? Because of the program. All right, so that means that absent the program, people wouldn't have been better off. What would have happened if we changed the program? All right, so these are causal things that are trying to get at the heart of what it is that a program is trying to impact. Now, the problem with impact evaluation is that you have something called the unobserved counterfactual. Basically, all that means is that we would love to observe somebody who received a program and the same person who didn't receive the program and compare them over time. Right? That's the ideal way to do it. But obviously, we live in the real world where you can't simultaneously give somebody a program and simultaneously not give them a program. And so what we do is we create what we call a treatment and a counterfactual group. All right? And these are the people that we're going to compare against over time. The key here is that we want the counterfactual, the people in the counterfactual group to have, on average, I want to be a little bit careful with some of my language here, because they're obviously not identical to the treatment group, but on average, they have the same characteristics. So when we talk about a group of people that receive a program, and a counterfactual group that we want to compare them to, we have strong belief that they look the same on average for the most part. And so what that gets us is that if these two groups look the same, we can compare them over time. And the differences that we see between these two groups over time, the only explanation for those differences in those individuals is that one received the program and the other did not. Right? So that's actually a very complicated thing to do, and I'm sorry if I'm shortening up this conversation quickly so we can talk more about it if anything in there is not clear. But let me just say that generally what we find is the best way to create this balance between the treated and the counterfactual group is through randomization. And I'm going to give you some examples of randomization in a minute, but what I also want to say is I'm going to plug a book that I have at the very end, but there's lots of books on doing impact evaluation. This is a design tree that I have in my book where we can actually think about different methods of evaluation that you can use and some of the assumptions that you need along the way, and you can pick out what is the best way to do it. So randomization can be done in many different ways. It's a very complicated type of thing. It's actually not very complicated for the most part, but choosing the right design so it fits with the program can be a little bit of a complicated task. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this other than to say there's lots of different options and there's different things along a decision tree that can help us to figure out what is the right way to evaluate a program. So now I'm going to basically end with two examples. All right, so first off, I'm going to give you, and in fact, I'm working on both of these, so I apologize. I think I told Joe I'd find somebody else's work to talk about, but I just couldn't in the end. So I got greedy, so I'm going to just talk about my stuff. The first one is an adaptation project that I'm doing or developing right now. It's not actually on the ground yet. We're hopefully going to have this moving in a couple months. But it's about explicitly about adaptation. So this is where we're giving weather information to farmers to help improve planting choices. East Africa has a huge problem right now with climate change. Predicting weather patterns in Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania is becoming increasingly difficult. And so farmers need these kind of short-term predictors a lot more than they ever did. And then the second thing I'm going to show you is a mitigation project in Rwanda. This is improved Cookstoves. This is the example I kind of hinted at before, with the idea of reducing wood fuel. So there's a couple things that we're doing on the second one, but I'll give you kind of the first stage results there. I won't have any results for the first one. So this is just to kind of talk about what it is that you could do with the program. So as I said, climate change is making weather much less predictable in East Africa. And so we want to know, can new techniques to generate short and medium-term weather forecasting for farmers actually affect how they do their planting practices and the outcomes for their farm? So we're working with the Trans-African Hydrometeorological Observatory, TAMO. They're working actually all over Africa. It's a network of these automatic weather stations. And so here we got some people looking at one, and this is a bit of a close-up of it. Sorry if that picture's not very clear. But this is a weather station that's installed in a community. It handles something like a 2 to 5 kilometer radius where it gets very detailed information about local precipitation, temperatures, all these types of things. And what they do is they take that information, they combine it with satellite data, and try to do really precise, very short-term forecasts for farmers. Basically, what this is trying to solve is, if you plant now, it looks like it's starting to rain, you plant now, right, and then all of a sudden you have drought for a couple weeks. You want to avoid that situation, right? It's possible that flooding may be coming. This is the type of information that they can get out of this and communicate to farmers. And they have these weather stations all over Uganda and Kenya and a few in Tanzania right now. So some of the learning questions that we want to get out of this. So first off, can short-term climate predictions be improved? That is, combining this localized data with the Earth observation data to provide farmers with alternative options for planting, timing, and input selection. Right? So does this kind of fine granular data actually add anything? Or can we just rely on kind of traditional weather forecasting that gets us close enough? Second thing we're interested in, how can this information be delivered to farmers so that the information is believed and acted upon? This is actually this is the part that I think is most fascinating about this project. In most East African communities, there's a local leader who kind of tells everybody when it's time to plant. In Kenya, they're called the rainmaker. It's a really nice term, but all it is some guy who's in the village, he's looking at the dirt, he's looking at the sky, and he says, all right, now it's time to plant. Right, that's the local way, the kind of traditional way that farmers use to decide when to plant. Now we have a bunch of scientists coming in and saying, no, don't pay attention to that guy. You got to, listen to the way that we're communicating and the information that we're communicating to you, because our information's better. Well, how do you overcome kind of those traditional systems? How do you get people interested and excited about this type of information? And then how do you get it to them? And then third, can these weather prediction information be used to enhance input usage and practices? Right. So I'm trying to lay out these questions in a step-by-step way. This is first, does the program actually add value? Then can we actually give the information to farmers such that they believe and use it? And then does that actually change the way that they farm and lead to better outcomes from their farming practices? So what we're planning on doing is selecting 300 communities that will be part of the study. And we're going to randomize 200 of those communities to receive this weather station data and one of these local weather station devices. And the reason why we're kind of dividing it like this is that we actually want to test explicitly the best way to communicate this information to communities. So what we're planning on is where we have a control group. So that's where there's no program that we're delivering. An area or communities where the farmers get information through text messages. They can sign up for them. They're free to use. That's kind of the normal program that they're running right now. And we've got a third group here where we're trying to think about how to get farmers excited about this through the local leader system. So not just offering the text messaging, but trying to go on the ground and think about how to get people interested in actually paying attention to this. And so these are different ways that you can actually run the exact same program. We're not changing here the way that they're analyzing data and the way that they're producing their forecasts. All we're changing is the way that we message and target farmers. There's lots of things that could be affected by this. If you don't have a phone, text messaging may not be very reasonable. If you don't believe your text messages, because I think all of us are tired of getting text messages all the time, right? People tend to ignore them, right? Are there ways to get people to pay a little bit better attention to these things? Both of these could have impacts on who receives the program, or who's actually taking up the program, that is, how seriously they take that information that's received, and whether or not they want to even act upon it. And so there's a lot of what I would say first stages here, just trying to understand what it is that gets people to even take up our programs and use them in a way that we think is the way that they should be using them. And then obviously from this, since we have a control group here, we're going to try and measure the actual impacts of this on all those questions that I mentioned before.
But what's the impact variable there?
So any one of these is what we're going to be testing. So first off, we're going to need to check and see whether the predictions are any good. But then we're going to be explicitly testing how to best deliver the information to the farmers. But then we can even think about the next stage on that is conditional upon them even taking it up. So maybe nobody wants to take it up in this and people only take it up in this. But let's say that some people take it up here and some people take it up here. All right, we can then start to understand, do they actually use this information to change the way that they farm? And does that actually change crop yields for them? Does it reduce the likelihood that they plant and then lose all their crops because of some unforeseen weather? There's a lot of household welfare implications that could be had here.
Sorry, Nathan, very quickly, what does take up mean? Are you measuring whether they know the information that's been communicated, or are you measuring whether whether their phone got the information and that's it?
Yeah, so there's different ways you can kind of define take up. For us, we're interested whether you actually do anything with the information. So you could always, think about whether or not people even get the information, but then, whether they use it, but then also how they use it. So maybe they use it on a little bit of their farm, but they are skeptical and they don't really believe it, so they do something different on another part of the farm. So maybe that's partial take-up. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time. I'm going to give you one more example here, and this is the Clean Cookstove study. I'm working with a couple of researchers from Germany and Rwanda on this. So just really quickly, 3.1 billion people rely on firewood around the world and charcoal. for daily cooking. That's 60% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. They cook on 3 stones. What that means is you just got 3 stones on the ground, put some firewood in between, and stick a pot on top. That's literally how you're doing your cooking. Obviously, firewood, transporting it is quite onerous for a lot of people. The households generally either buy it or more generally go out and cut down forests to get it, and so there's a big concern about deforestation related to it. There's also huge concerns about health. For a lot of these households, the women do the cooking inside, and so there's huge amounts of smoke that are resulting from that, and you actually see a lot of deaths attributable to that kind of smoke. So there's different examples of how you can kind of improve your cook stove situation. There's very simple ones. There's ones that you build into the house. There's ones that are really nice looking but quite expensive using pellets. What we're focusing on is trying to reduce wood fuel consumption. So it's more like something like this where it's still using wood. It's still, has a wood component to it, but you're just using a lot less of it. It's a bit more efficient than just setting on 3 stones. So the things that we want to understand, so first off, in the short run, what is the demand for improved cook stoves? And is there any to begin with? Do people actually want these? How price sensitive are households to that demand? Right? So if we want to give away clean cook stoves, that's great. And I'll show you the results of giving them away versus having a price on them. But a lot of concern is that if you just give them away, that's not really a sustainable market plan. And maybe there's some kind of in-between. So maybe you don't give them away for free, but maybe you subsidize them some way. So our first question, what I'm going to actually just show you today really quickly, the results I'll have today, is about the short-run take-up of these cook stoves based on different prices, basically different subsidy levels. But we're actually just now analyzing some data that we collected where we're trying to answer some longer-term questions. Right? So we went into the communities and we handed out these cook stoves at different price levels. We're interested, do people continue to use the cook stoves years later? That's actually a big, important question. Right? These things get broken. Maybe people don't really fully understand them. Maybe, as is very common, keep in mind it's the woman that's doing the cooking. She's the one that's most affected by the smoke ventilation, and oftentimes she's the one going out and collecting firewood. It's the husband who decides whether or not to buy the cook stove. So already we've got a problem where the person that's affected by them the most is not the one that's actually making the decision about buying, for the most part. Does it actually improve health outcomes? That's a little bit harder to tell because we need to first be sure that people are actually still using them to have any kind of confidence that we're measuring changes in health. We're also interested in whether or not learning about the improved cook stove actually increases demand in these areas. So one of our hypotheses is that your neighbor has it, oh, you're saving a bunch of time and money on wood, maybe I'll start taking this up as well. And then the thing that I'm absolutely the most interested in this project about is, are there broader implications for the local economies? So one thing we don't tend to think about, economists call them general equilibrium effects, maybe we could call them rebound effects. Right? Go back to our economics 101. We deliver cook stoves. It reduces the demand for wood. What happens to the price of wood in communities when demand is decreased? The price is going to go down. Right? If price goes down, that means that other people can now afford to buy wood when they weren't buying it before, which means you could actually see more households taking up wood until we get right back to the exact same amount of wood usage as we had before with a new equilibrium price. So we could actually have zero mitigation effects in communities where cook stove usage is even 100%. Right? So just because people are using the cook stove doesn't mean, and this is going back to that mechanical calculation that the engineers use, just because they're using it doesn't mean that we're actually reducing CO2 by 1,000 cook stoves times whatever reduction we would expect. All right, so I think this is a really exciting potential outcome. I'm hoping that we don't see anything, but I'd be really surprised if we don't see some kind of rebound. So really quickly on the study design. So we had over 400 communities and 42 districts that were targeted by the program. But the thing is, we didn't need to work in all 400 communities, so we took a subsample of them. Right? And we have the study population is 84 communities and 6 districts. and they were chosen to be the most representative of these broader communities. All right, so this is to say that you may have a very large program. You don't need to necessarily do an evaluation on the entire program. You can just take out pieces of that program, pieces of areas that you're working in, and run your evaluation there. So then we took these 84 communities and we randomized them. And I haven't talked very much about the specifics of randomization. It's just me sitting in my office using Excel, creating random number generating random numbers. What that creates is a control group where we didn't offer any Cookstoves, a full price group where it's the business as usual, you're paying the full price for these Cookstoves, a half price group where you're paying half the price of the Cookstove, and then a zero price group where you're paying zero, right? It's handed out for free. So now we've got these different types of subsidies so we can see whether or not people take them up when they're paying the full market price, whether or not you have higher take-up when you fully subsidize them, whether something in between might also help out. Okay, so maybe I'll just skip that other than say that we're doing some data. We just finished some data collection now, but the results I'm going to show you are based on some data that we collected in December 2016 through January 2017. And then we had a household survey in November 2017. Basically, this is where I'm going to end today, just a little bit of the results that we had. So when you have to pay the full price, take up in the communities was 10%. At half price, 18%, and at zero price, it's still not 100%, right? But we had much higher rates of take-up. This is actually a very common finding with other program interventions. So if anybody here is familiar with mosquito bed netting, there's a big debate about what kind of price those should be at. I think there was a lot of argument that they should be charged at the market rate so that only people that really value them are actually buying them. But we find that there's actually very low take-up for bed nets. The health implications are so high that we actually now subsidize them very dramatically. So basically the main findings are that high adoption in zero price group and going down dramatically once you start taking away the full subsidy. So if we want high adoption of fuel-saving Cookstoves, right, we should be considering a subsidization method of some kind. So I'm going to end by saying thank you and linking to my book on impact evaluation if you're interested in that. And it's my email address and my website. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Nathan. Really interesting talk. So I'm going to open it up for questions, and we'll do 3 questions at a time. Sorry. Yeah. So we'll do 3 questions at a time and then get Nathan to respond and keep going till there are none. So, and then.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, your mic is working. You can just press here.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
This will be that.
So first, excuse me. Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was very insightful, especially getting introduced to the different terminologies, the RCTs. We listen a lot and read a lot about it, but the way it's taken or carried out in the field, that's quite good. On the portfolio kind of evaluation, when will the results be available, or how is it like? Because we have 76 projects at the moment which are approved projects. And have you done a random kind of a thing, or you're just going systematically for all the projects?
Let me just quickly respond to that, Sahilji. So when we started this, so we looked at all 55 that were approved till B19.
Okay.
And so the analysis that we've done, and I'm hoping that we can get some time to discuss some of the results that we're getting with OPM as well this week. But we basically looked at everything exhaustively till B19. And then we are currently coding and putting into machine readable forms so that we can analyze them for the remaining ones. So that should be done The remaining, we'll get up to 76 only in the next 2 months, but the 55 will be available basically before the end of the week to discuss at least what's coming out. Yeah. The other tough questions I'm going to let Nathan deal with, but so after Sahel, go for it. And if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is G from OPM. And I just wonder how we can show the collective impact, because this look like very project-specific evaluation, but as a GCF, we may need the collective impact, how you can aggregate the numbers, because we have a lot of projects as we know.
Very good. Any other third question? Yes, Joseph?
Thank you, for that good presentation. Just looking at what you presented on the uptake of the stores, you mentioned that you did look at the distribution, the uptake of insecticide treated mosquito nets, comparing that. How did you go deep into that? How did that data look like in terms of looking like comparing the two? And in the same, probably the same area. Then, if you allow me, I will ask a second question. With the information, did you consider this assumption with the groups taking up information on weather? The assumption that this assumes that there will not be information, similar information from other groups or other actors. So, did this study take into consideration that kind of information being given aggressively by other actors in the same area, including the control group? Thank you.
All right, so I'll answer this last two questions first. So when I present these studies, I obviously present a lot more details and talk about the data in a lot more detail. So I'm sorry that I kind of skipped through that a bit here. When you collect household survey data, and you have, the different treatment groups. There's a lot of different types of analysis that you can do on that, and maybe we can have a separate conversation around that. And I would actually love to have a discussion around analysis methods. So I'm an honorary senior lecturer at Makerere University in Uganda. I'll be there next week teaching a course on this topic. So I'm ready to have that conversation. But your second point about programming in these areas is a really good point. And so this is a serious problem that can arise when doing impact evaluations. So if you're running a program and you're trying to compare people that received the program to people that didn't, and another organization comes in and runs something very similar on your group that didn't receive it, that obviously becomes a big problem for you to be able to infer the impacts of your program. And so I've seen lots of evaluations that kind of fall apart because they didn't take that into account to begin with. And so planning for impact evaluations is really critical. I didn't really get into the details about how one does impact evaluations, but the design, RCTs and a lot of designs that I do are what's called prospective, which means that we're thinking about them at the beginning of the program, not coming in at the end. When you do a prospective design, you have to think about a lot of things in the very beginning that could go wrong. And I think, part of my specialty is to be thinking about what goes wrong. I tell people that I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist on any of my research projects. So I think everybody's tired of me complaining that everything's going wrong all the time, even though I believe in the end we'll make it all go right. But it's hard to get it right. And so it's one of these things where you have to kind of plan for these things ahead of time and be prepared for exactly those types of issues. But then you can also do things like at the end line, when you're following up on people, collect information on other trainings and other interventions that they've received, so you can kind of at least figure out how big of a problem that might be. Those of you that are, just as a slight aside, those of you that are interested in microfinance, this is a huge problem for impact evaluations of microfinance. I do a lot of work with microfinance organizations, and I can assure you that any results that we have on impact on the impact of microfinance cannot be relied upon because of exactly this issue, because take-up rates in the control group are really, really high generally, and so you no longer have a design that works. So it's a slight transgression. So on your question regarding basically aggregating the impacts, So you can't know the impact of a whole portfolio without understanding the impact of the individual pieces of that portfolio. And so the aggregation has to start from the bottom up, kind of thing. And basically that means it's a lot of work to kind of figure that out. Now, it'd be great if we could randomly select 10 of the 55 or 80 proposals or projects that are going on, that are being funded, randomly select those, run impact evaluations on those, and then figure out what the impacts of those are, and then infer that that can be scaled up to the entire portfolio. It's almost always impossible to do. Some programs just are not able to be evaluated quite this way. So in the end, I think what we're going to do is we're going to identify the programs that are most appropriate to being evaluated and kind of focus on those. Whether we can scale that up to the entire portfolio, I'll leave that to Joe to speculate on. But this is also where good monitoring of the individual projects, monitoring and evaluation strategies can be very helpful. At least getting data from these projects so we can at least infer some of these things, so we can understand what some take-up rates might be. I don't know if that really answered your question very well, but.
Could I just add to that a little bit, if you don't mind? The idea is that clearly there are other organizations. If you look at EFAD, so they've decided that a certain percentage of their portfolio would have impact evaluation designs, just so that they could inform their overall goal, which had been specified by the board of EFAD, which is we will reduce poverty for 80 million people, right? But it meant that there was a certain percentage of their portfolio that needed to have impact evaluations. What we are discussing internally and also with Sohail Sab is the idea that we would take a certain proportion of projects, but also discuss what these representative projects might look like, so that they might have to represent the portfolio, together. Given that there are certain types of projects that GCF funds. But what we want to be able to do is to verify that, yes, those impacts that projects are postulating and aspiring towards are actually feasible or happening on the ground. But to even do that, we need to start with something fairly basic at the project level. And then we can take it up to the subgroup levels of these projects within the portfolio and then scale up to GCF. But like Nathan said, unless you start right from the basic from each one of the projects, it's impossible to magically come up with a number at the portfolio level, right? So in all of this, the monitoring aspect is clearly really important, because we just want to know, are they doing what they said they would do? And then we get to ask the second order question, which is what you answer with impact evaluations, which is, okay, if they're doing what they're saying they're doing, then are they getting to the impacts that they said they would? So it all becomes fairly conditional. I do want to get back to you, Nathan, and comment a little bit about this. Ensuring if your control group actually stays the pure control group question. Yes, in my experience as well, and I've worked on impact evaluations for many, many years now. Yes, things go wrong in the field. But the nice part of this entire conundrum is that you can still go forward with even other donors coming in under two conditions. First, at the beginning, if the likelihood of other donors or other development partners coming in is equally distributed between the two groups, between your control group and your treatment group. That's one. And second, if you change the question and say it's not so much GCF over nothing, it's GCF versus, say, your control group is not no program, it is the control group is, say, UNICEF delivering bed nets. And so you're comparing organizations then. And so your question is no longer GCF versus nothing, it's GCF versus, say, Jeff. That works. That's a good question that you should be able to answer. What is your comparative advantage? So you could, there are important questions that you can still answer even with that kind of challenge on the ground. Okay, Solomon, and then, oh wow, okay, we have lots. Please introduce yourselves and...
Solomon Asso, Principal Evaluation Officer, IEU. The first question you answer, I want to ask the question, when do you randomize? Just for the audience generally, are you going to do the randomization in the middle of the program after the managers roll out the program implementation? When is the timing? So that we have clear understanding. Second question is with respect to your recommendation about the subsidy. I think I would be careful. It's kind of in any program that's subsidized, the uptake is very high. That's right with mosquito net, with index insurance, and any other subsidy program. And the important policy question is whether that subsidy, when the subsidy opt-outs, the uptake would increase. That's the first question. Second question is whether there is a better way of doing with the same resource alternative intervention. Just to point out that. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back. And then I'll come to this.
Thank you for your presentation.
Just hold it down till it turns green.
Hi. My name is Jacinto Buenfil. I'm an outside consultant working in project preparation.
Sorry, what's your name?
Jacinto Buenfil. I thought it was interesting in terms of the types of questions that you ask in the evaluation. I'm wondering if there is some adaptive management or capacity in that, because, for example, when you were doing the sample analysis on the GCF portfolio, you were only talking about mitigation. So, for example, if adaptation is taken into account in terms of number of people that are being benefited, or in your question on the information, climate information, maybe the climate information is there, but there's other things that happen, like pests and things like that, that might affect the productivity of the farmer. Or in the other, with stoves, maybe the design is not good, and that's why there's not the uptake, even if it's subsidized. So how do you take into account these other variables when you're asking questions?
Thank you. It was actually a good learning point for me. I will have two questions. I'm Fola from the Office of Portfolio Management. I want to just, on one of the slides when you were talking about the learning that is being done, when you did a review of the portfolio of GCF projects, and you said that most of the projects don't have theory of change. But how do we, because right now it is, can we have a theory of change for mitigation projects? It is very easy and common for adaptation projects, but when it comes to mitigation, how do we handle the issue of having to have a theory of change for each of the projects? The second question I would like to also is, when we talk about the causality and attributable measurement of impact, you talk about the assumptions that need to be made, but that most of the assumptions in proposal right now, they are only looking at what they can afford to do, but no rebound. But is it possible for projects to actually, put assumption of what cannot be achieved because they are trying to sell, they are marketing a proposal? Do we want to look at the rebound side? It's just to see what should we be looking for in a proposal.
Yeah. All right, so there's a couple good questions here, and I think you had a couple. Actually, it was more than one. I think it was more like 5 or 6. So I'm going to try to get to all of these. So to be clear, randomization happens before a program starts. So if you've started a program, if you started all of your activities, it's too late to randomize, because what are you going to randomize? Right? So what we're ideally randomizing is the implementation of a program. So there's been some more traditional impact evaluation that was done in the past called retrospective designs. It's still done in cases where you can't do prospective designs. You can do retrospective. It's a much lower quality. It's more difficult to do, and there's a lot more assumptions that you have to make in order to believe some of the results. But those are designs where a program can be done for years, and then you come in and try to figure out what's actually happened. Ideally, though, you're thinking about evaluation from the very beginning, just like you're thinking about monitoring and evaluation from the very beginning. Because it's hard to go back and retrospectively find out what people were doing with their programming. It's much better to be able to figure that out from the beginning and implement it going forward on it. So I work with organizations from the very beginning of their program, design phase even, thinking about how to design programs a little bit better. That's a great time to be working with them. I also work with organizations who are a little bit more advanced on this and are already running some programs who are thinking of expanding into new areas and thinking about whether or not their program is worthwhile to kind of grow, right? And so those are good times to be kind of bringing in an impact evaluation. A poor time is to be thinking about it after you've already started everything. You can still do some stuff with that, but it's a much lower quality. I love the idea of the alternatives to subsidies. I agree that there's lots of different things you could do to kind of increase this type of uptake. To be clear, what we really wanted to highlight in that study is that the difference between a subsidy and a partial subsidy is huge. So you go from a 10% take up to an 18 to an 80. Right? So that initial jump is basically doubling the number of people that are taking it by offering a 50% subsidy. Offering 100% subsidy quadruples that last one. So the impacts from the subsidies have basically a nonlinear effect here. And so that's where I think, thinking about the right amounts for subsidies can be really, really important. But I agree completely. If there's alternatives, if there's better ideas out there than subsidies, I think it would be a great way to go. People often, or organizations often combine Cookstoves with training and other information campaigns. But that only goes so far when it comes down to how much are people going to actually pay. And keep in mind, I can't highlight enough, the person that's paying for the cookstove is most often not the person that's most affected by the cookstove. And so that's where I think the subsidy level, that's why you see this nonlinear jump there. So a couple of your points, I think, if I got everything that you were asking. So, I didn't mean to necessarily classify, I mean, I did do it, but I shouldn't really classify, one of these as mitigation and the other one as adaptation, because they actually have a lot of overlap in both of them. And so there's actually a lot of things that are going on common to them. I gave the example in the beginning with the portfolio about the mitigation just because it's a really striking number. It's a big number that's expected to come out of Africa. These are the types of programming that's very common in Africa, and I'm trying to give some examples of where our mechanical number generation that we use to get to those numbers may not be accurate. And so that's just kind of the example that I was trying to give. But you also asked about other things that could be happening in these communities. So, when you deliver weather information, but there still could be like pests that could be, happening. If I understood your point there well, one of the values about randomization is that we're trying to create a group that receives a program that looks exactly, on average, the same as people that don't receive the program. And that means that things like pests and other things that affect one group are affecting the other group. Now, that may not affect them equally once you start to give them weather information. So maybe now they start to behave differently around the pests and things like that. So there could be, say, some nonlinear effects related to these other things that are going on, but those changes are due to the program. So if you have one group that has a lot of pest infestation, and you randomize, hopefully you've got just as much pest problems in one group, treatment group, as you do in your comparison group. That's what we kind of hope for with this type of randomization. I say hope, there's things that we can do to test for it, but in the end, sometimes you just can't test for everything. So in fact, you don't need to do randomization if you could literally collect information on every single thing. So one of the early areas where randomization was touted was in agricultural development and determining the best, like use of fertilizers and things like that. What it was determined is that you don't need to randomize because you can actually measure almost everything you need to know about soil and about a weather plot. And you can create comparison groups. The problem is humans are just so complicated that there's no way that we can measure everything. We can't literally find out everything about a person. And so randomization just gives us kind of the expectation of being the best or the closest to that. I think you also touched on the quality of the design of a product, if I heard you right.
Yeah, on the stoves. So it's a similar.
Right, for the uptake. So this is a super important concern because the quality of the stoves can matter a lot for whether people want to take them seriously, but also how convenient are they to use. So if you're running an evaluation of this guy up here in the corner, all right, in rural Senegal, in rural Rwanda, which is where we did this, people can't get access to those pellets. I mean, that would be a ridiculous thing to kind of be testing. But researchers have done that. I mean, there's actually highly published, well-cited work that's delivering that type of cook stove to people, and they find no impacts. Well, no surprise, because people can't actually use this. So, we have to have a sanity check when we're doing these things. That's where the theory of change. That's also where good M&E can help us to kind of avoid that before we get to that stage. Because, I mean, I don't think any of those researchers are as embarrassed as they should be when it is revealed what technology they were trying to get people to use. And no surprise that people were not interested in doing that. And then I think to your questions, so I think, developing a theory of change for mitigation, I think you were asking about mitigation versus adaptation. I think, both of them are challenging to develop theory of changes for. My colleagues and I, we do theory of change workshops where we sit down with organizations and think through their models. Keep in mind things like the Cookstoves. Your theory of change matters a lot when choosing which cookstove you want to be delivering, right? That's a big part of it. And so that's, maybe in some ways the theory of change matters even more for some of those types of programs. Again, you don't actually know if your theory of change is right. So as a researcher, I never use the word theory of change. I never use that phrase with other researchers. We talk about models. We talk about our theories. And economists write their models down with math. All right, so in the end, you're writing down a model, and then you're testing to see if that model is true. That's a hypothesis test. And that's what you kind of are doing with the theory of change. When you combine that with impact evaluation, you're actually testing to see if your theory of change is right. And if it's wrong, where is it wrong, and what can we do to adjust it? Doesn't matter. Maybe it's wrong, but it's not in something that actually matters. Maybe it's wrong, but it's in something that really, really matters. Like, for instance, which cookstove you're handing out. And then, so I think your last point was about assumptions about what can and can't be measured, I think, or maybe if I understood you properly.
The measurement you talk about doing is that assumptions, most of the projects that you have currently only talk about what's.
Well, could you use the mic?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted a clarification that how can projects that are submitting a proposal, and yes, you said most of them don't say anything about the rebound. Is it possible for projects that are, sort of marketing, I want to submit a proposal, how do I talk about the negative effects?
Right, so if you're trying to get funding from a donor, you probably don't want to talk about rebound effects. So, I think all applications have a tendency to want to overinflate their impacts. And so I'm showing these numbers to suggest that that's probably not what's happening in the real world. But that doesn't mean that, I blame the proposal writers, or the programs necessarily. We don't know these things. But these are open questions. Researchers don't have answers to it. We have very weak evidence when it comes to actual programming. So I can hand you some models in which I say this is a possibility and something to look out for. In the end, it also could be very context dependent. So just because maybe we find some rebound effect in Rwanda doesn't mean that rebound effect exists in Vietnam. So we have to kind of be testing these things out, and this is where tracking with good data, running impact evaluations, even running very simple impact evaluations where maybe you're not necessarily trying to measure all the total impacts from a program, but just thinking about some of those first stages about take-up and usage and how people in the community use these things. That type of learning can be really important for a program and almost impossible to predict in the context of a proposal, I think.
So we're actually beyond the time that we promised we would stop, but I did want to end with a couple of comments that I thought that Nathan was making that definitely hit home for me, which was, one, clearly with most programs, we want to understand how well are they being implemented, and monitoring just going from activities to are you even delivering all the things that you said you would. That's the part that monitoring needs to look into. And beyond that, then measuring impact is all predicated on just making sure that your monitoring is giving you the results that you want. So they need to be speaking to each other at all points. And Paula, this sort of speaks to, I think, one of the points that you were alluding to as well. The second is that of theory of change, something that we within GCF have spoken about a lot. And again, the other point that was made during the Q&A was, should we expect proposals to come up with risks that they have? Probably not, but since we are all sitting on the other side of these proposals, it becomes our responsibility to at least be looking out for those and to be ensuring that we are doing our due diligence to figure out where could these be going wrong, because that's a substantive risk for us, right? And so questioning them in a very critical, collegial and critical way so that together our learning is enhanced, not just of GCS staff here, but also our project teams on the ground. So those were the two things I wanted to take away. But what I'm also going to encourage all of you to do is, Nathan is here for this week. If you'd like to come up and chat with him on the 17th floor, please do so. Let Gigi know that you'd like to, and she'll make sure that Nathan has a time and a space to accommodate you. And we'll be talking to some other parts of GCF as we go along this week as well. But with that, Nathan, thank you so much. Wonderful talk. We really enjoyed it. And look forward to spending the week.